I am George Sanger, and what it is that I do is I say my name when they tell me to say my name. It changes a lot, but for the past 15 years, the bulk of it has been sound for slot machines, and for the 15 years before that, sound for video games. So my brother's roommate in college was this guy, Dave Warhol, and I found out that he was in the video games business. He was working for Intellivision. And I liked video games. Now that seems a little normal now, but it was really kind of very different then. We can get into that. But I was ready to say, look, I want to get involved in this weird business that you're in. I will do anything you want. I will take out your trash cans for free. What do you want me to do? And he said, no, I don't need anyone to take the trash cans out. I actually need someone to compose music for this game that's penguins ice skating. And I said, oh, okay. And he said, you do write music, don't you? And I'm like, yeah, well, sure. You know, so I did. I wrote music. He needed a 10-second theme, and I wrote the 10-second theme. But the technology for it, I was not very confident as a composer, and MIDI hadn't really taken hold yet. So I had a 4-track reel-to-reel recorder, and I played this little melody, or I played the bass line over and over. I played that for a couple of chords, and I kind of started a little melody over it. And then I went back and redid the bass line again and extended the melody out. So it was almost like I was cut and paste editing the thing, you know, from the beginning. So I just recorded it with my guitar until it sounded good. And that took a couple of days for a 10-second tune. And I copied it over to manuscript paper. And that took me a while too, because I got a little dyslexia, a little ADD. And I turned it into Dave, and he turned it into code. And that went into the Intellivision game. Thin Ice. I'm starting to realize, you know, Dave did actually a lot of the other music for that game, but people credit me with doing the music for that game. So I did a 10-second tune for that, for Thin Ice, for Intellivision. Dave Warhol, producer, and Keith Robinson, who still owns Intellivision to this day, was like, I think the executive producer or something like that.
Rick Sanger was my college roommate. We're very good friends, and so I knew George Sanger through Rick. And at a certain point in time, I asked George, so what are you doing? And he said, I'm the Earl Scheib of music. And that was a guy who paints cars for 99 bucks. And so he's like, I'll write any jingle for 99 bucks, just like that. That's what he was up to in his career. So we had this opportunity to, somebody wanted a song, one of the producers wanted a song in Thin Ice. I reached out to George and said, hey, what do you say? You want to do this? And he's, sure. So yeah, I told him what the game was about, penguins and all that, and then he wrote the thing, and just on sheet music, and I ended up putting it in drivers and orchestrating it. And then I forgot about this, but I did all the other music in the game. He did the main title, but the other ones, the game over, round over, and stuff, was the stuff that I had written around his stuff. So I heard what his style was and then was adding more things into it. But the quote I like to say about George of that time is, you could call George and say, I want a song about penguins in outer space eating hamburgers. And then he would write something. And then you'd get it back and you'd give it to somebody and they would listen to it. And they say, that sounds like penguins in outer space. They're eating hot dog, no hamburgers. I mean, it was just that dialed in, just nailed it.
Paul Edelstein was a relative of a friend, and he was working on games too. He was working on games for Sirius software on the Atari 800. He'd done a game called Way Out, which I was actually just talking to John Romero today. Way Out is kind of known as one of the first-person games. It wasn't a first-person shooter. It's just kind of an obelisk that goes in front of you and you follow it through a maze. And the follow-up to that was called Capture the Flag. And Paul wanted an interactive soundtrack for that This was his idea. I want a soundtrack that'll get somehow more intense under certain circumstances. So he gave me an Atari Music Composer cartridge and an Atari 800, and I put in some kind of snippets of sounds, and said, well, this bass, I gave him some bass lines that would all sort of work with some melody lines that would all sort of work with each other. It wasn't anything complicated. I think it was all in one chord. You know, it was just, sometimes it would be a swinging, walking bass line, and sometimes it'd be a double speed, it'd go to double speed, but the bass line would go to double speed, but the treble line wouldn't go to double speed until a certain bar line had been reached, and by then, you know, so it was a little bit random and a little bit fixed. Anyway, that was how it worked, and he cracked the code of the output of the Atari Music Composer cartridge, turned that into the assembly language bits that he needed, and so I didn't do anything really technical except work on a commercially available composing package. I did one more, actually, Paul Edelstein ran out of work for me to do, so he taught me Forth, the programming language, and so I kind of sidetracked with that for a while. Then there were a few years that passed where I really didn't do that much in game audio, and then Dave Warhol showed up again with some Nintendo gigs for me, for the 8-bit Nintendo and Game Boy stuff. And by then, this thing called MIDI had emerged. And so I had been composing stuff on a MIDI rig with an MT32 sound module. And it was a really nice little rig, and I got really pretty fast at it. But the great relief to me was it saved me from all the pitfalls of not being able to play piano in real time. You know, any dyslexic or ADD issues that I had were cleared up by MIDI. As long as I wasn't working in real time, I actually could make things that sounded good. And it was so beautiful to get to do that. And so I would write in MIDI for the MT32, and I would send the standard MIDI files over a 300 baud modem. Actually, I think at first I might have even mailed the discs to Dave. And he had these sort of special formulas. He had cracked some of the Japanese code that, you know, the Nintendo audio implementation evidently wasn't that well documented in English. And so he'd figured out some things that other people hadn't figured out. He was well known for his awesome tone algorithms. You know, he figured out how to do echoes and phase shifts and stuff like that. And so he made my melodies sound actually pretty good comparatively. So all I had to do was write MIDI files. So it was very easy on me. I started to think a great deal about myself. You know, I thought of myself as being very capable and actually pretty smart. And as I gradually learned, looking back, there were other people who were doing some things that I had no idea, you know, the depth to which they were going in their programming and, you know, just the sort of thoroughness of how they knew the hardware and the software. But I guess I was writing some pretty good tunes, so that was okay. As we got into the PC stuff, yeah, I would get called to write music in like 4 different versions, you know, and a lot of times it was 1-note version, and I'd send off that MIDI file, and then there was like the 3-note version for, I don't know, ad lib, and then there would be there was a Disney sound card or something. There were like 4 different sort of platforms you're writing for. And it was a real pain in the butt. And it was like that all the way from the earliest PC stuff. I think that the worst was Attack Sub. It was SN some number Attack Sub that John Ratcliffe was the producer for. SN, I don't remember numbers, I'm sorry. I had to do like 4 versions of each of these tunes. And there were a whole bunch of little short tunes, and really most of the process was keeping track of my versions, because if I changed something, I had to change all 4 versions and ship them all. And it was really a pain in the butt. And it was like that all through all these early PC games until we came to The Seventh Guest. And I was complaining to Tom White, who was then working for Roland. I was trying to set up some kind of an arrangement. I was always trying to hit him up for free equipment. And I was trying to pull publicity, cooperative publicity promo deals with him. Like, okay, here's what we'll do. I'll do a demo of all my great music on the MT32, and we'll print an Avatone sound sheet. You know, those plastic records that would go out in a magazine? And like I was on the phone with Avatone, like getting the prices from them, and I had this whole idea of what we would do together. And he was like, yeah, okay, George, it's kind of a nice idea. We're not going to do that. And in one of those conversations, I asked him, I started complaining about all the different versions that I had to write. And he said, well, why don't you just write for General MIDI? I said, General MIDI, what's that? He says, well, just write for the sound canvas. You write you write it once, and it plays on a whole bunch of different sound cards. I'm like, okay, I'll do that. Can you send me a sound canvas? No. So I bought a sound canvas, and that was right when we were doing Seventh Guest. And so I got the sound canvas. I think the first thing I wrote was the opening tune for the Seventh Guest. And I think the second thing I wrote was that boom, bling, boom, bling. Yeah, I think X downstairs or something like that. So one of the walking around tunes. But it like just kind of came natural. It was where my hands dropped on the keyboard. And I wasn't doing anything smart, but I didn't know what chord I was playing. I was just like a dog on the keyboard. So I wrote all that stuff on the sound canvas. And then the idea was, and then I wrote General MIDI emulation tones for the FM sound cards, which were the predominant sound cards at the time. And so there's a whole story about what happened to those tones.
And 2 stones.
So this was kind of the first, and then I made a big deal in the manual of the Seventh Guest about this is the future of sound cards. This is General MIDI. I'm taking a big chance here. You'll be able to play this game on sound cards that haven't even been invented yet. Well, because it turned out the only General MIDI sound card was the sound canvas. So I made it so you could play it so once we were done, you could play General MIDI on sound canvas and MT32. I made a set of tones for that with my Team Fat guys, with Kevin Phelan mostly. And then on the other thing, the FM sound cards. And then we shipped the game. Then it turned out that these General MIDI sound cards started being manufactured. People started coming out with other General MIDI sound cards, and they sounded really awful. So the fact was that General MIDI actually wasn't completely standardized yet. I mean, it was a standard to a point, and I felt like I had sort of screwed the public. So at first, people were calling me up and saying, well, let us send you our sound card. You can tell us what you think about it. And I was thinking, I will endorse this sound card, and they will put my picture on the box. And I had all these pictures, I had all this vision of how great I was going to be. And it didn't turn out like that at all. It sounded like crap. And what we ended up doing was, this happened over and over again. And I thought, how am I going to fix this? So we created a thing called Fat Labs. It was a service to tweak these General MIDI sound cards so that General MIDI that was composed on a sound canvas would sound good when played back on these sound cards. Well, that's an interesting question. I did Beautiful Song and Dumb It Down for the Beeper. Yeah, because I couldn't get myself to write a one piece, one line. But, if we looked at it today, I think, if it were writing for an orchestra, for a big, I think I was so happy writing 4-piece stuff. I think that I feel very comfortable in that zone. I think it's something Beatley about it. I think I like things to have a melody, chords, rhythm, and a bass line. And right around there is where I would write most comfortably. And then, you know, just artistically speaking, theoretically speaking, I would write to that. And then if someone wanted me to dumb it down for a speaker, I would do that. And if someone wanted me to dumb it up for an orchestra, I would do that. So in those days, I wrote just the way that I liked it, which was very lush, considered very lush for those days, and then I would dumb it down for the dumber sound card. I did. It was melodies. You know, I mean, really, people weren't so much using appoggiatura. I'm not that. You know, I got a degree in music from Occidental College, but the guys in my department were really musical. I mean, really musical, and I was just kind of rock guy trying to keep up. But I learned a couple of tricks, and I always kept in mind that if Mozart were writing for a string quartet, you know, he would write as much as he could for the capabilities of that particular string quartet. So I always felt like I was writing for a very interesting group of one-armed musicians, you know, 2 boops, a beep, and a and you know, it's like violins, kind of want to play one note at a time. So why don't I write the best I can? And you know, well, it has some advantages over real instruments. I mean, it can play as fast as you want it to, and it can play very high and very low. So those are things I could take advantage of. And I can have this one arpeggiate like crazy, or I can swap voices. You know, so I use tricks like that. So I tried to maximize the melody. I tried to go for surprise. I tried to use all the chords that I knew. I tried to make it get tense and then relax. I tried to put as much as I could into it. I had no sense of the beauty of minimalism. I have no sense of letting someone listen to music and cherish it. I wanted to cram as much cleverness and communication as I could into every possible little nook or cranny of the music that I could. Nonetheless, there was a point where I could look at one of these tunes and say, you know what, I've done all I can with that, ship it. So it was really nice. It was a nice medium that way. You know, you could squeeze a lot into it on one hand, and on the other hand, you could say, it's done. No one's gonna complain about this. This is as good as this stuff's gonna sound. Well, early on, it was not that different, because I knew that if I wrote it to sound good on the MT32, for a while I was writing on MT32, then I tried to push that out as the standard. Why? Because General MIDI didn't exist yet. So the early Miles sound drivers, John Miles came over to my house one time. I had his BBS at my house. So I don't know if you know who John Miles is. Yeah, sure. So John came over, and he took me out to lunch, and he asked me a couple of neat questions that I like to brag that he asked. He said, George, I just wanted to ask you some things. What does MIDI stand for? And why are there black and white keys on a keyboard? And things like that. And I felt, well, I must be super smart, because the great John Miles is asking me these questions. He could have asked anybody in the world those questions. So yeah, part of this is the story of why did I have such a great big ego? The universe was setting me up to think I was awesome. I'm sorry, it wasn't me. So John was asking me my advice on how to set up his drivers, and I said, why don't you have it so that when it plays back on an MT32, because that seems to be the best thing out there, that it sends the correct instrument call, you know, I can't remember, program change request, so that the correct instrument comes up. So I sort of invented a sort of off-brand General MIDI myself, and that's in the early Miles drivers. So I wrote a lot for that, and MT32 also, it could only handle that many voices at a time. I don't know, 8 at the most, maybe 6 realistically. And so it was about the same. It was about the same as writing for the consoles, except that when I overwrote, instruments would drop out sometimes, but that really never kind of bothered me or anybody else. I mean, we just weren't that fussy. And it sounded really kind of pretty good nonetheless. And if it was dropping out, well, the way I wrote, the melodies were, what was going on was pretty complicated at that point. So if you listen to like the MT32 versions of the Swan Lake stuff that I did for Loom, you'll hear voices drop out. You'll hear voices drop out, but you won't care. Because, I mean, it's Tchaikovsky. It sounds great. It's like a piano arrangement of Tchaikovsky. Yeah, there's some things that aren't happening, but it's because the guy's reaching way out here, and you kind of forgive it. It sounds like the guy's at his limits. It sounds like Keith, what's his name in the Rolling What's It? So they're like Keith Richards in the Rolling Stones. You know, what makes it exciting is he misses sometimes because he's at his limit, and we're all with him struggling. So yeah, aesthetically, I think it worked out. I could rationalize it anyway. I never worried about that, but the way that it came back to me was I would write these 2-minute tunes, and they would come back and only use 1 minute and 10 seconds because they'd run out of memory. And so I was always like, why aren't you using all my music? You're putting the loops in the wrong place. And they're like, we ran out of memory, George. And I'm like, so? I just lived with it. So it's totally not the, you know, I was not the technical guy, and I was thinking of myself as the technical guy and giving myself credit for that. So yeah, that memory constraints, it kind of didn't get on my radar. Except every once in a while somebody would say, every once in a while somebody would like face me down and say, George, you don't seem to know the first thing about music for games. I'm like, I don't, and inside I'm going, do you know who you're talking to? I mean, innocently. And, you know, I'm like almost the only guy in the world doing this. Well, not really the world. I wasn't considering the rest of the world. And I was only thinking about PC. And in that context, I think I was one of only a very few people doing it. So I was thinking, yeah, I know what I'm doing. So I'd say, really, what am I doing wrong? He says, well, first of all, on MIDI track 0, I'm like, there's no MIDI track 0. You know? and you're going beyond such and such a range. And I'm like, there's no ranges in MIDI. And you're, you know, and I'm writing music that's going too fast. And I'm like, well, I'm one of the Tchaikovsky tunes. I was actually pulling the tempos off a CD I had that was directed by Seiji Ozawa. You know, I was in the right key signature, I was in the right time signature, I was doing it just like that, and they came back at me and said, this is too fast. Why are you writing at, what is it, 300 beats a minute or something like that? Well, it's Tchaikovsky, it goes, that's how it goes. They said, well, Cakewalk doesn't play back that fast. Well, after a phone call to Hendershot, Greg Hendershot, I think, the guy who wrote Cakewalk, he's like, well, why would anyone write music that fast? And so we got him to change the code, I guess, so that it would handle that music. Something changed. Anyway, I would get kickbacks from guys like that to me just sounded like, well, these are well-meaning programmers, but they don't know what's going on. When in fact, it was kind of a combination of I didn't know what was going on, they didn't know what was going on. We're all struggling in the same sort of battle. But I think, you know, we progressed. We argue about different things now. One of the calls that I got was from this very interesting guy, Brian Moriarty. He's going to speak on Loom on Friday at 10 o'clock. And he's going to have I brought him I gave him some pictures of the Swan Lake score. So anyway, let me start over. I got this nice call from this guy, Brian Moriarty, who worked at Lucasfilm Games. And he had heard that I was kind of the MT32 guy, and he wanted to write to that platform. And he sent me this packet of scores for Tchaikovsky Swan Lake. And so the assignment was take 7 of these movements and put it into MIDI for this game. And so that wasn't too hard. So I made sort of my first, what would you call it? My first sort of, you know, system, you know, my first sort of task list. It was the first time it got a little complicated for me. I made a chart, a two-dimensional chart. The vertical axis, you know, the rows were the names of the movements. The columns were, I have entered the notes into the sequencer. I have double-checked the notes. I have put the dynamics in. I have put the tempo maps in. And so I just kind of went down, and then, you know, and I've tested them, things like that. It was just so simple. But I thought, you know, I'm really struggling with the elements. I am a titan wrestling with the gods, you know. So yeah, I put in these 7 movements, I think it was, and first I just entered the notes just right off the chart, and I'd play it back, and when notes started to drop out too much, I'd make what I thought were sensible reductions. Then I went back and put in the tempo maps, and then I could actually put on the Seiji Ozawa CD and tap along. I did tap tempo, nothing to it really. And where it would get jerky, I'd smooth it out a little bit in the Mark of the Unicorn Performer software on a Mac SE, I think. And then I would go back in and listen to the dynamics and make sure that the loudies were loud and the softies were soft and the balance was good. Nothing to it really, except in those days, nobody had ever, when we did classical music on a computer, it was all unchanged tempo and no dynamics. So if you go back and dig through the literature of that year, you'll find that nobody else was doing any tempo changes, and nobody else really kind of cared whether it was loud, soft, or balanced. So it really wasn't hard to set a new benchmark. And with all due respect to for my colleagues, I know that there was stuff going on that I have no idea what it was. But so there were other people that must have been at that level of artistry, but I was and still kind of am a little blissfully unaware of it. But what I've learned is whenever you think you're the only person doing something, you're absolutely wrong. Whenever you think that you're the first person to do something, there's no way that you are. Maybe you are, so you gotta just add, I think I'm the first person to do blah, blah, blah. And whenever you think that it was you that did something, you were standing on the shoulders of some giants, or your friends helped you do it, or someone else would have done it. And, but somehow there you are, and somehow the thing got done, and somehow your name is on it, and thank you, God. I had done Loom, and I had done a bunch of other things for like karaoke clients in Austin on the MT32. And a rumor had somehow got to me, I don't remember how, that there was a company in town that was doing a game that was writing to the MT32. And so I started writing these letters to Richard Garriott. You know, you need to work with me, I am the fat man. You know, I am the MT32 guy. You know, you're making, but I don't even know what those letters said, but it was very, it was emphatic and it was strong. And it was, I think it was the sort of the dawning of that fat man character, you know, the cowboy hat. Yes, I am the greatest of them all. You know, I've got a team of composers. Well, I didn't quite have the team ready then, but there was a guy that I was working with, Dave Govett, who was a young guy, and he was like, he had actually kind of come to me and said, hey, can I come over and see your studio? And I said, yeah, I guess so. And so like an hour later, he said, can you pick me up from the bus stop? Okay, I can do that. You know, and like, hey, I'm a composer too. So I had him compose some things. Well, he was really good. He wrote a bunch of the stuff for Maniac Mansion and things like that. And was really, you know, I liked his work. It hadn't really blown me away, he had blown Dave Warhol away. Dave Warhol really saw it before I did. So I went out to Origin. I met with Chris Roberts. Chris said, well, we want something that's sort of between Star Wars and Star Trek the Motion Picture. And this, I think this was the first time that somebody in gaming asked a composer to impersonate a film score style. I might be wrong, but I think I'm right. And I'm like, this is great. I think I can do this. And I went back and I realized I was really busy. And it was kind of a daunting task. And I mentioned this to Govett, and he said, oh yeah, I got a couple things rolling around in my head since high school. I'll just jot them down. And like 2 days later, he sent me the combat music and the opening fanfare, which are absolutely the defining tunes for that whole project. And they were just like, they were just in his head, fully grown. They just had to come out. He'd been thinking about them. Dun, 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 dun. You know, nobody had really written anything like that original. Maybe they had over at Sierra Games, you know, maybe there were some sort of royal things, this and that. It might have been really good. I'm still unaware of it, but I think it was really kind of, it was maybe it wasn't above the bar, but it was the bar. It was at the bar. And so when I went to my first GDC, the year that Wing Commander and Loom came out, they had the first awards show. You know, they had the first awards for video games ever. And 2 of the 3 games that were up for the Sound Award were Loom and Wing Commander. So and that was the first time that I wore the cowboy hat in public. And there was only one other person there, I think, that did sound for games. I think it was David Teal. And someone came up to me and said, George, well, you're the only person that I've ever heard of that does sound for games other than, you know, Rob Hubbard. I'm like, really? Really? So when last night at the VGM get-together, somebody said, you know, people were talking about what they knew all the same people. You know, and someone said, this industry is too small. And I said, it's not too small. It was too small when I was like the only guy at the GDC who did sound. Then it was too small. I said that as part of the list of unsolvable problems. And I don't want to say that I'm necessarily the guy putting that out there as, you know, the giant complaint. I'm more saying, okay, we look at this world and what do we keep hearing? Actually, I heard the other day from a friend of mine who's into Landmark. He says when we hear something over and over, when we have a complaint that we bring up over and over again, it means we're pulling a racket on ourselves. We're pulling a con on ourselves. We as game audio guys keep saying over and over again, we're the low man on the totem pole. You know, we're not even getting, what was the rest of my quote?
Not on the creative radar.
We're not on the creative radar. I don't think that's really necessarily true. And even if it is, it's not a legitimate complaint. Who cares? These guys are building a rocket ship to the moon, and they are engineers for the most part. At least it was at that time, and to some extent it's still. And they have to build a rocket that can fly. And the sound guy is going, it would be super cool if the rocket were pink. And they're going, yeah, that's cool. You know, they're buried up to their necks in wires and they're connecting things and they're trying to figure out how this thing's gonna fly. They got a lot on their minds. Yeah, they're gonna need to paint the rocket at some point. And yeah, pink would be cool. And it's actually, compared to what they're doing, it's fairly easy to paint the thing pink. But right now they're going, you know what? I just don't want anyone to laugh at the thing. You know, I'm very serious about building this. And I'm very serious about putting off a sense of reality so that people will buy into my reality. And a lot of times the audio is just kind of not on the list of things that have to be done to make that happen. So what we have to do is just do our best, tuck in and present as creative, as beautiful, as supportive, an addition to the whole gestalt as we can imagine. And just hope it gets...
Damn it!
You know what that is? That's those audio guys. What is all this sound? Why are all these sound effects in our project? Why do we have all these sounds? Did I ask for these sounds? No, I'm trying to make a film here. So this is what I'm talking. This is what I'm talking about.
Wait till rush hour and mess up a whole bunch of people.
Yeah. You try. The programmers are trying to get a thing done, like we're trying to make a movie here, and then there's all these noises coming in, and people are like, "Yeah, well, we need to make these noises to warn the people that we need to make." Yeah, well, that wasn't on my list of things I got to do today, and you know what? That's a pretty long list. So I have every empathy. I have every sympathy for the people making the games, and I apologize to you, game makers, for having added hassle to your lives, and you've done your job very well, and you didn't need us to do this music. You didn't need us to cram all these ideas down your throat and say, there, the best part of this game, I mean, the last thing you needed in your lives, game makers, is to have people play the game and say, you know what, the best thing about this game was the music and the sound. You didn't need that, and sometimes you got that, and I apologize. But maybe for you people who played the games, maybe it was nicer for you. I like to believe that. So, thanks for telling us. I'm sorry, this is the good stuff, you know. You can play a tune in the background that sounds like a siren.
There we go. That's improvising with the environment.
Yeah, make it work. That's right. Whose idea was this to have ambience? City ambience. Shouldn't we be recording this? Give me that microphone. Wait, here. Just wait.
Nice.
So other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the theater? Well, let me put it this way. I'm really glad to be working for Magic Leap now. Let me put it another way. One of my last conversations with my dad before he passed on a month or two ago is that he said, I'm really glad that you're finally working somewhere where they appreciate you for what you can do and for who you are. And with no meanness meant to all the producers and programmers who did work with me and did appreciate me, it speaks to this business. It's a brutal business, and a lot of that brutality gets experienced by the sound guys. And so it is really a blessing when something comes along where you're appreciated. And I hope that that happens to everybody who works in game audio, and they all really kind of deserve that. That's one of the important things about Magic Leap. So what happened was that for about 15 years, I've been mostly working in slot machines. That's been keeping me alive. And that game, that business sort of had to change. Its time ran out. And I didn't know a year ago at GDC what I would be doing next. And I kind of had thought that everyone had sort of forgotten about me, and I didn't really see much of my book. Never really sold very well. And I just kind of was starting to get comfortable with the idea that, okay, well, it's time to move on to the next phase. I don't know what the next phase is, but it'll be something. And Graham Devine, one of the producers of The Seventh Guest, surfaced out of nowhere And he was working for a new company, and I sent him a message just like, "Are you a GDC?" And he said, "Yeah, we need to get together." I said, "Yeah." I thought we were getting together to talk about old times, but it was an interview. And he said, "George, you've got to stick your head in the machine. It'll make a believer out of you. We've got to get you to Florida." And he dropped me in position as the head of audio for this huge thing that is, to me, it's NASA meets Disney. And so coming out of this long period of kind of, I don't even know how to put it, just kind of getting comfortable with realizing that I'm not the biggest thing in the world, but I'm part of the world. Realizing that it's okay to just make a living. It's okay to, as long you want to do your best. That's also the period that I wrote my book in, and a lot of the think tank conferences happened then. But musically and game-wise, I really, went from being the only guy doing it to really having trouble finding anybody who really wanted to hire me. I don't think because of quality issues, just because there's so many people in the business and so many really good ones. So quite a contrast from being the only guy there to like not being able to get a gig really outside of slot machines. So falling into Magic Leap, being put in a position where I can build a team to create systems for a platform and build a team to create content for a platform, and be respected and put in a position where all of what I've done over 30 years or so can now pay off, even though by all rights I ought to be retired. It's really an incredible blessing. And I think that it's going to be the start of a whole new, it feels like when we first started doing this. I think this sort of augmented reality-ish space, I think these sort of wearables, I think something's going to happen here that's going to be even bigger. In fact, you know what, Govit wrote to me publicly on Facebook and said, I think this is going to be bigger than Team Fat ever was. He says, I think this is going to bring, this is going to change how people live. And I get to take part in that. So here we go. Ya-da-da-da-da-da. Thanks for doing this. I don't feel like I did anything. At this point, I don't feel like I did anything spectacular. I think I was in the right place at the right time with some intent to make things positive. And I think my friends were there to help. I think that there were shoulders to stand on, giant shoulders to stand on, whether I knew I was on them or not. I think every time that I thought that I was doing something incredible, I wasn't alone. And every time I thought that I had been forgotten and that it would amount to nothing, I was completely off. And in the long run, you really don't know what's going on at all. And the universe has it under control. And whenever you look back on it, it's a perfect divine composition. It's a perfect symphony. There is no note out of place. It's as though we had access to time travel and could go back, change things, come back, find out that it's not really that great, go back and change it a little more. Maybe it's getting better. We go back and forth until it's just the way that we want it. Then we go back and destroy all the time machines. And this is how the world is. And I don't know if it's we that does it, or if it's spirit, or if it's God, or if it's some game developer. But somehow the great game design document is really, really well put together. You may not notice as you're respawning the 70th time after a really rough level, but it's a really good game.
And the music's getting better.
And the music's getting better. Yeah, yeah. We've come a long way from the boops and beeps of yesteryear.